It's a very great privilege to introduce John Bryant. He's a regular speaker at Faraday courses, and he is a Professor Emeritus of Molecular and Cell Biology at the University of Exeter. He is also visiting Professor of Molecular Biology at West Virginia State University. He is a pioneer of bioethics teaching in universities for scientists. And he's written about that, and a number of his books should be on the bookstall. John gave the London Lectures in Contemporary Christianity in 2002. He's a former chairman of Christians in Science, a member of the International Society for Science and Religion, and he speaks frequently on the science-religion interrelationship and bioethics in churches and other venues up and down the land. Now, he is also someone who has been twice listed for the National Award in Science Communication. And indeed, we're very privileged to have John, who is a tremendous communicator.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I like to, I love in the mornings when I'm driving to the university, listening to Chris Evans. He's mad, but I love the guy who comes on after each news item and he says, after the 8 o'clock news, and says, "Welcome to another day on planet Earth." And here's one of my favourite bits of planet Earth. I just thought I'd put up here. It's a privilege to live on our beautiful planet, and as a scientist, it's been a privilege to be part of investigating how the planet works, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Okay, let's get going on the actual talk. So these are my own particular take as a biologist on the science and religion debate, and I think each scientist will have their own particular view. Each scientist who is a believer will have their own particular view of where their science interfaces with and dialogues with the faith communities. But for me, obviously, it's biology, and that will become more and more apparent as we go through the talk. So it is some aspects, by no means all, and you're going to be hearing other aspects from people like Rodney, very much from a much more astrophysics point of view, later in the weekends, in the week. So just remember that this is incomplete. And what I want to do is to introduce the whole area by thinking about science and what is called the new atheism. It's just the old atheism shouting more loudly, I think. and with much more media-friendly folk to head it up. And then I want to think about what science is. What have I been doing for the whole of my life? Well, you may ask, but I have some ideas. and some focus as a biologist on evolution, which is still very much a hot topic in the interface between science and faith. So, the new atheism. If you're part of the chattering classes, then you're very much living in a secular world. You read the serious newspapers, the broadsheet newspapers, and they very much have, if you like, an agnostic or even atheist or secular take on things, on the whole. I'm going to put the other side of that coin later, but part of the chattering classes, very much a secular world, so much so that this correspondent in The Guardian has to write, I'm a Catholic, and it became later very clear in his article, a practicing Christian Roman Catholic. But I'm also sane, and I think this is the thing one wants to get over, that we're not weird people because we believe. We're not kind of grasping things that are unbelievable. These days people find it hard to accept that religion and rationality can coexist, and that's exactly the claim that Richard Dawkins is trying to make of us, that we are irrational. That as scientist believers, we hold these two bits of our brain in kind of separate boxes, and we don't. We are whole people, they're integrated. This logo, which will appear from time to time on some of the slides, is the logo of the Test of Faith resources, which we will be hearing a little bit about later, I think, won't we? So here's our secular world. This is I think she's called Ariana Shine, who persuaded Richard Dawkins and Polly Toynbee to fund these buses. They weren't 100% sure of their faith position. Probably. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life, as if to say that we religious people were worrying and we hated our lives. Very far from it. And so here is Richard's theological, if I may put it that way, the theological discourse. The atheist historian Terry Eagleton likened it in terms of a theological tome. He said, imagine somebody writing a biology textbook and they had in front of him a book of how to identify British birds. And this was, so it's not really a theological tome. And those theologians who read it find it very, very, very disappointing. The trouble is, it's also very plausible. That people who know no theology and little science find it very plausible. And I was talking to a former student on campus the other day, and he said, you know, you're a Christian believer, I've decided to look to see if there's anything in this, so I started by reading The God Delusion, and I said, do you think this is the right place to start? But it's sold huge numbers of copies, The God Delusion. And that's really where, if you like, the chattering classes are basing, he's become the kind of media hero for the atheist movement. And then here we have another atheist, an altogether different kilter. This is Professor John Dupre, who is a colleague of mine. He's the professor of the philosophy of biology in our School of Social Sciences. He is also an atheist. He disagrees strongly with Richard Dawkins in terms of what genes do and don't do. And we might hear a little bit from me tomorrow about what we call reductionism, the idea that we're just a bag of genes. And John Dupre will heartily disagree with that. The two of them are completely at loggerheads over the idea of materialist reductionism. Nevertheless, John is an atheist. And this book, Darwin's Legacy, explores the social acceptance and the penetration of Darwinism into general thinking. But they are both absolutely clear that Darwinism undermines the only remotely plausible reason for believing in God. Now that comes from a philosopher, John Dupre, and I find it amazing that somebody of his qualification, my colleague John Dupre, actually imagine that our belief in God is based on a lack of understanding of biological systems. And once you understand them, then you lose your belief in God. This is a God of the gaps, and he seems to think that Christians believe in a God of the gaps, which we do not. So, and John and I get on very well, but he's very uncomfortable being in the same room as somebody of a strong faith position. It's very interesting watching him when he and I are integrating together with maybe somebody else. And the last two quotes there are from Richard Dawkins. You know, this is the bit about we're keeping our brain in two separate boxes, sincere but mistaken, and he says we have no evidence to support the belief in the deity, and I suspect that's because he's not looked at it properly, honestly and openly. But I do agree with him, we have evidence to support evolution, but evolution is not a god. And I'd like to make that very clear. and now more recently, the distinguished astrophysicist and quantum physicist Stephen Hawking, just over here, in his new book with his American colleague Mlodinow, because there's a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. Excuse me, Stephen, where did the law of gravity come from? If you mean nothing, that means nothing. It's not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. We call that a category error. He's mixing up, if you like, ideas that lie outside science with things that can be investigated by science. But he repeated it in last Saturday's Guardian. 4 of the gods of science, as the Guardian called them, and I'm afraid it didn't include me on this occasion. Perhaps I'm a cherub of science, I don't know. But they were asked to present one fact about science that the general public should know, and Richard Dawkins and David Attenborough came up with that wonderful fact about life being a unity. The genetic code is universal. I mean, I just think that's fantastic, and we'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. But Stephen Hawking decided that he wanted to tell the public the fact that we don't need God to create the universe. Well, even I can tell the difference between an opinion and a fact. That's not a fact. And there were so many things he could have said, but he felt he had to promote that. I'm very sorry that Stephen's doing this, because I think previously I felt he was really quite open, at least talking to religious folk. So that's the atmosphere in which we are working. Now we have to do a bit of sleight of hand here. I try to clip the clips into the PowerPoint presentation, but it keeps cutting the end off. So we're actually going to have to go into now find the videos. Come here. Okay, let's shrink it down. So we should be able to find these video clips. Come on, this way. There we go.
It's not a terribly interesting story how I've come to accept Christianity. Broadly, my background was that of a Christian and so forth, but I think it'd be fair to say that by and large it was not an active. I think in certain ways I am privileged to step in for C.S. Lewis and also Dorothy Sayers. The way that my conviction, if you like, comes from an intellectual rather than, if you like, a sort of experience of the one Paul arguably had on the road to Damascus. And it is really an excitement about for the claims of Christianity are. Because as the people themselves realised in 33 AD, what had happened was so staggering that you can imagine vaguely how they were struggling to make sense. They were using words which were effectively failing left from centre. This made no sense at all, but illusion. So I'm happy to imagine myself on an adventure which I hope has hardly begun, and that too promissory note. But if I compare the promissory notes of the Christian faith in particular, and compare them to, say, the promissory notes presented to me by a materialist who insists it's all meaningless, I have to disagree gently about this. But on the other hand, I think I know where you stand, but I'm not entirely persuaded that you look at the evidence in quite the way that I think will be most productive for your future.
That was Professor Simon Conway-Morris. He's the Professor of Biology here in Cambridge. I played that to show you that there are people who are honest in their approach to science and faith and have a rigorous intellectual approach to it. Looks like I've lost the... There's always dangerous doing this, wasn't it? Come here. Again. I'm sorry about this rather clunky way of things, but I wanted to show the videos. Right, let's go back to here. So what Simon was saying there was that his faith is intellectually respectable. He follows in the footsteps of C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers, who believed in order to be whole people, you've got to engage your faith with the whole of you. It's not just your emotions, it's gut feeling. It's also got to be respectful here. We do not keep, as I keep saying, our brain in separate compartments. And Conway-Morris is a beautiful exponent of that on that little video, Test of Faith. So we've got an atheistic atmosphere. We've got people like Simon Conway-Morris and myself and many others who are intellectual believers. But on the other hand, about the new atheism. But like Cole Morton, in their surveys of the wider British public, said that the grip on the wider British public that the chattering classes would have us believe. It may well be that 70% of the British public actually believe in a God of some sort. It is not necessarily the Christian we understand him, she, or it, but him, her, or it, but nevertheless some sort of belief. And so Cole Morton is about the church of everywhere. That when you have the funeral of celebrity, and of Jade Goody shining down on us like a star, for example. And I heard Cole talk about this at the Dartington Literature Festival. It was very interesting. And he wrote in Third Way, and his new book I'll show you in a moment. Organised religion has waned, but this new faith, this kind of universal, fluffy faith has been born. And I think if we're interested as Christian believers, engaging with people, we maybe need to start there. There's some sort of feeling that there's a spiritual element, like, even if people don't put their finger on it in quite that way. And so there, his book is God Still an Englishman, How We Lost Our Faith But Found New Soul. And it really is, it is the story of that which is happening, as I say, outside the chattering classes in the UK. So, what do we got? Let's trace some history. One or two terms I'm going to throw at you. Positivism is really the basis of the kind of Dawkins approach to life. David Hume was one of the early exponents. The idea of positivism is that the only things that are real are those things that can be approached by empirical methodology, by the methods of science. Nothing else is real. And that's really what Richard Dawkins' position is, that it is a positive position, a positivist position, that the only realities are the objective realities that science is able to investigate. And that leads us on then to scientific empiricism. It's a kind of the scientific version of the same thing. But that then leads, if you like, to placing science on a kind of particular pedestal as the only route by which we can gain any knowledge whatsoever. Science, if you like, becomes a religion, and I call that scientism, kind of word science, and its operator in biological terms, evolution. But also, milling around, since the 1970s, we've had this other strange phenomenon called postmodernism, which says to us that there's no big story, there's no meta-narrative, there's no major truth. Well, that obviously wipes out religion, but also that everything is relative, which wipes out science as well. Because if my scientific truth and your scientific truth, even if you know nothing at all, are equivalent to each other, then there's no science either. Your views are as good as mine. And we see this actually in debate. We hear it in debate on the BBC. Radio 4 is very careful to have a balance of views. Even if one view is held by 0.1% of the population and the other one by 99.9% of the population, you've got one of each. And some other modernist take on these discussions has been quite extraordinary. That views that are based on complete lack of knowledge are nevertheless as equally valid as those that are based on years of experimentation. So postmodernism, no big story, your views are as good as mine. Science is challenged by that, and so is religion. And that's intermingled with this kind of scientistic thread that we've seen. And the final thing I'd like to say about the 21st century is we live in the political world. This is a quote from Bob Dylan. If you're a Dylanologist, you will recognise the album it comes from. If you're not a Dylanologist, you probably won't know it because it's one of the weaker albums. But I have them all bar one. The one I haven't got is his Christmas album from last year, which was atrocious. But the point he's making in the song is how decisions are made in society that are not based on human values, not based on love, etc. They're all based on political expediency. And in terms of bioethics, and we'll be discussing this again a little bit tomorrow, we see this actually happening. That what is politically expedient tends to override what we might call human values, things that we might want to take seriously. And that's also part of the climate in which we're operating in this science-faith arena. So, what is science? Well, I've been a scientist for, I did my PhD here in Cambridge, and I guess the first stage of your PhD is the first stage of the rest of your life. You become a working scientist at that point, and that was a long time ago. And I think I've come to think this is what science is. It's an investigation of the natural world. It's based on human curiosity, but it also has clear societal dimensions in that what we choose to do in society, what we choose to fund, and the way we choose to use the scientific knowledge has clearly got societal dimensions. So it is not free of social construction. Nevertheless, at its purest, is curiosity-based. So we assume that there's an objective reality. This is not a postmodern thing. There is an objective reality there to be investigated and discovered by these empirical methods. We're also open to the idea that subsequent discoveries may modify our understanding. So we are as Michael Polanyi, the philosopher, said, we are attempting to approach the overall truth. We put it verisimilitude, approaching the truth, knowing that we're never there. But nevertheless, we believe there is something there to be investigated. Now, I know that each of us have got a calling from God, and it's a privilege to serve every calling we have been given. For me, it has been a privilege to be an experimental scientist, working for most of my life on DNA, starting here in Cambridge in the heady late 60s. And there is a very special privilege and thrill for a researcher, which is very hard to put over without sounding arrogant. But I think I say this with as much humility as I can muster, that there are those moments when one of your postgrads, one of your postdoctoral researchers comes into your office and says, John, that experiment that we were doing, look, these are the results. And for a few minutes, just you and she are the only two in the world that know that, until you go and blab it in the copy room. And then we might add actually already, because we are thinking his thoughts after. But that for me has been just those amazing moments. They don't occur very often, but they do occur. That has been a privilege, and it's all about finding out more about God's creation. So these methods, for me, what I'm talking about here, this objective reality, is the creation of the Lord God. And it's done at all levels. So we can start with the DNA molecule, the most wonderful molecule in the world, without which none of us would be here. Or we can go way down below that. We can go to atoms. We can go to subatomic levels, down to things like quarks. We can come up through biological entities like single cells, like wonderful human beings like Paul Radcliffe. We can come up through ecosystems. We can come to planets. We can come to solar systems. We can come to universe. And if we were to start with the quark and measure it in terms of its size and multiply by 49 times, we would have got to the size of the universe. 49 orders of magnitude cover the range of measurements we can make on the material existence. It's unbelievable, but it's true. And this is all God's work, and we are privileged as scientists to investigate this. But are there things that science can't tell us? Well, I think the first thing I would say, and this is why I'm very critical of people like David Hume, and although you can't say that to his face anymore, of course, but people like David Hume and Richard Dawkins, that it's a major, major assumption to think that to assume there's nothing else. To close your mind, it's almost unscientific to say that there can't be anything else, because the scientist has an open mind about this. And so my own view here is that believing in a spiritual level of existence and a spiritual level of beingness is intellectually respectable as not believing in those things. And the clip from Simon Comrie-Morris was, I hope, helped to illustrate that. We're not talking here about me having my head in the sand and these other guys being realists. They are making major assumptions that they cannot substantiate. And so are science and faith incompatible? Well, I think they represent different kinds of knowing. I tend to think of knowledge as being a bit like, if you stretch the colours of the rainbow out linearly, we have different kinds of knowledge along that spectrum. But when they're all brought together, they make a coherent white light. And scientific knowledge might be at one end of the spectrum, and religious knowledge might be at the other, but they kind of merge into each other. And so we can talk about testable evidence about the Christian faith, the sort of knowledge you get from historical investigation, the sort of knowledge you get from the court of law, for example, all part of that spectrum. So for me, there actually isn't even a divide between scientific knowledge and religious faith. They're part of a unity. But there are models. I go quite a lot into high schools to talk both on genetics and molecular biology and on things like intelligent design and evolution to RE classes. And at least one of the boards examining AS and A2 must be flogging the models here, because I'm quite often asked, which model you support for the science faith thing. And so the conflict model is the kind of Richard Dawkins model. The two are completely incompatible, and you can't really be one if you're the other. But another scientist called Stephen Jay Gould, who's had a lot of quite fierce discussion with Dawkins, they're both strong evolutionists, would suggest that actually these can exist side by side. Magisteria is, the magisterium is like the area of authority that's exerted by a particular discipline, and these are separate. And again, well, he might be happy to live with that, but I couldn't. I don't think I could possibly live with that. That when I'm speaking in church on a Sunday, I'm in one box, one sphere, and when I'm in the lab on a Monday, I'm the other sphere. It doesn't work. So for me, that we have this convergence thing, and we could put my spectrum in there if I wanted to. So I think that we have a compatibility between science and religious belief. This is what I tried to show in another video, so excuse me while the technology clanks into action.
The 18th century philosopher Leibniz asked, why is there something rather than nothing? Science has described how our universe began with stunning success. But 3 centuries later, science is still unable to answer Leibniz's question.
The scientific understanding of the Big Bang tells us a lot. It tells us about the dynamics and the contents and the evolution of the universe as it was at early times and as it's evolved into now. But science and our detailed scientific understanding of the Big Bang doesn't actually address the question. That's not science. I mean, it's untrue, but it is different from science. And that's where bringing in other truths about the reality of human existence comes in.
You know, we can describe the age of the universe, we can describe how stars and galaxies have evolved over time, we can describe all these things, but we can't answer why is there a universe, and why is there a universe that would evolve toward the point of having human beings that are having the kind of conversation we're having right now. Why are there concepts of hatred and love, and why do people do things to each other that don't promulgate natural selection or survival of species that make no sense? You know, why a lot of things just aren't answered through science, and I think most people, both Christian and non-Christian, are grateful for that, because there's a lot of interesting things about life that don't have to do with measuring physical forces of nature.
These scientist believers, then, say science must acknowledge its limits. But they also say faith must be consistent with what we know through science, rather than being based in what we don't know. For them, a God of the universe could hardly be threatened by any advances in human knowledge.
That's why I think it's exciting as Christians to go exploring, because we're never going to find anything that's outside of God's realm. Everything is part of this majestic creation, and the more you discover, the more amazed you get by thinking about God. And so I think exploration is a divinely Christian activity, and people should be excited about it.
Excited, that's great. Right, let's see what we can do this time. Yeah. Oh, got it. So the first voice you heard was Professor Catherine Blundell, who is the Professor of Astrophysics at Oxford, and the second person was Professor Jennifer Wiseman, who in addition to her chair in American University also has some sort of work with NASA. So these are both very experienced out there in space. Well, they've never been into space, but they're both very, very much involved with research on the structure of the universe and so on. So let's move on. Let's move on to biology, specifically in evolution. Last year, you might have just noticed that in 2009, Darwin got a bit celebrated. It was the 200th anniversary of his birth, and who knows what other major figure was born the same day. Any offers? Same day as Charles Darwin, another major figure in history. Abraham Lincoln. And one of the things I like to do is to, when you're discussing over coffee, which of those two have the most influence on human society? Just have a nice discussion about that. So Abe Lincoln and Charlie Darwin born the same day. And of course, it was also the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species by Natural Selection. If you go to London and visit the Royal Academy, as you go into the big yard outside of Royal Academy, the Linnean Society is on your left. And you go into the main door of the Linnean Society, and facing you is the lecture theatre in which the papers by Wallace and Darwin were first read. And so you can sort of feel a bit of history there. Neither of them were there, incidentally. Both their papers were written by somebody else. It's very strange. So, the year of Darwin, evolution via natural selection. And of course, we all know that Darwin was impressed by the creatures he saw. Initially, I must say, the giant tortoises on the Galapagos. You could see the divergence between the different islands. But when he came back with his stuffed birds and his skeletons of birds, he began to realise that actually they were an even better example of divergence from single origins in different habitats. And here's just a range of the species that he found on the different Galapagos islands. The idea being then that habitats, environments in some way act on the genetic diversity within species and draw out those that are best suited to the environment. One of the criticisms that we biologists hear a lot about evolution is that, you know, when there's an environmental change, you've got to wait for the mutation, but that is not true. That all living organisms already, over the years they've existed, the millennia of which they've existed, have started to develop genetic diversity. And I need no further explanation of that than just by looking at you. The genetic diversity is clearly apparent. And you know, we could come up with some form of natural selection that said, you know, that for reasons that I won't go into, that only blue-eyed people would breed successfully. So I'd be all right, and I'd have lots of descendants. But if brown-eyed people couldn't breed so successfully, they would gradually die out. So the genetic diversity is already here. And this is what and we know this in particular, for example, from this bird here, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. And natural selection acts on the pre-existing genetic diversity. So let's update Darwin a bit. Darwin was puzzled by the riddle of heredity. He didn't understand how characters could be passed on, if you like, untrammeled, unblemished, because he thought there was some sort of mixing. And it took Mendel to demonstrate that inheritance was based in individual things that we call genes, in which are actually chunks of DNA molecules. So heredity is based in genes. And every single gene in every single organism is potentially variable. And in many cases, the variation between two individuals doesn't count for anything, because we call that a neutral variation. And so if we were to look at lots of our genes and compare Rodney and myself, for example, we would find, on average, we differ by about 1% in the average gene. But most of those genes make no difference to our appearance or our metabolism, but some do. So natural selection acts on the genetic variation within a population, and it's usually slow. Evolution does need a lot of time. But I will say that some events speed it up. The movement of birds to different islands certainly was a major factor in the development of the different Galapagos finches species, because they became isolated from each other. There was no chance of this one now breeding with this one, and their genetic divergence began to push them apart. And then sometimes even more dramatically, we can have, if you like, the separation of two populations into species can happen overnight by some sort of chromosomal event. And if you go around the shores of Britain and you see what is called cordgrass growing, most of that is a new species that came into existence in 1908 by chromosomal change in a sterile hybrid. So that's sort of what I call a speciation event. But mostly it is slow. It's a long, long process. So what about evolution and religion? Darwin's theory was not as I think some both religious writers and some non-religious writers would have us believe. The theory was not universally rejected by the church. And we can find in Darwin's letters to friends, we can find in the correspondence of the time, we can find that there was some quite enthusiastic acceptance of the theory of evolution by people who were devoted Christians. So there wasn't a universal rejection. But the idea of rejection has come from this debate at the Oxford meeting of the British Association of the Advancement of Science, which happened in 1860, the year after publication. The debate between Wilberforce and Huxley. Wilberforce was a bishop, as you know, and Huxley has been called Darwin's bulldog, and they had a debate about the validity of Darwin's views at the British Association meeting. And again, the popular view of this was, one, Wilberforce represented religion, and two, Huxley represented rationality, 3 that Wilberforce was defeated by Huxley. If you read the reports in the local newspapers at the time, there was no such view that one won the debate. The view at the time was that actually they each made very good points. And the second point to make is that Wilberforce actually was a scientist bishop. He was the vice president of the British Association of Mathematical Science, and really it was a debate between old science and new science. That Huxley was trying to get biology put on a much more professional footing and felt that this would help. And so the debate was not conducted under the terms in which it has been presented. So, not as it seemed. And many religious believers, including myself, believe that evolution is an amazing set of mechanisms through which God creates biodiversity, including humans. Now, I will say straight away that if you think about evolution deeply, what it actually means at the level of the gene, there are things here which are dark. Things, therefore, that we don't fully understand. That this generation of genetic diversity also creates genetic diversity which is deleterious. It creates mutations which are harmful. And that's part of the same process. That's the dark side of evolution. And you know, when you've seen a genetic disease in a child, inherited because of a change that's occurred, maybe in past generations, and now two have come together, you know, it makes you ask, you know, where is God in that? And yet we are still believing that the process of evolution depends on that generation of genetic diversity. A wonderful set of mechanisms, but if we're honest and thoughtful, there is the dark side. And maybe that's something we can talk about. So let's return to a little bit of the evidence now in terms of, as we understand it now, the initial evidence that Darwin relied on came from ecology and morphology. He was studying the way that the different finches had exploited habitats and their morphology, their shape, particularly their bills, but other things as well, the body plan, enabled them to exploit that. Niches were exploited, and reproductive wastage and success were very much part of the equation. You don't need very much in the way of reproductive advantage to become dominant over many generations. It might be that, you know, that this bird has managed to bring up one more young per year than this one, a clutch of 5. Over the generations, that will result in one becoming dominant. So reproductive wastage and success very much come into Darwin's thinking. That was all part of the original theory that he and Wallace came up with. And then we have the fossil record. Now, I know that people have tried to, is undermine the right word for rocks? I'm not sure. Undermine the fossil record. But the fossil record is very clear. People like Simon Conway-Morris, much of whose work is based on fossil organisms, be very clear about this. The fossil record does give us an indication of very, very simple organisms first appearing on Earth probably as long ago as 3.4 billion years. Then cells of the sort that we're made of appearing about 2 billion years ago. Multicellular organisms appearing maybe 1 billion years ago, maybe not that old, maybe more recently than that. And gradually more and more complex organisms appearing on planet Earth. Until finally we get to the most complex organisms of all, the primates, the great apes, and finally, the most complicated organism that's ever lived on the planet as far as we can tell, the human species. And modern humans, in the way that we currently define what it is to be a human, that's something you might want to talk about, are actually very, very, very new indeed. In terms of evolution, it's just a snap of the fingers. Modern humans may well have only been here for 150,000 years. We are Johnny-come-lately on the planet, and haven't we done badly here? So the fossil record takes us from the very simplest cells right the way through in a series to the most complex organisms. And then later, when we look at the genetics, for example, of the Darwin's finches, we can actually see the genetic change that causes the beak to be large. You can actually see that genetic change. And in the general population of finches on other islands, it's an extremely rare mutation. but in the particular group that have got the large nut-eating bill, that population has been favored. And the genetic linkage between organisms that appear to be closely related in evolutionary terms, and compared with the distant genetic linkage between organisms that are distantly related in evolutionary terms, it's uncanny. What we now understand about genetics fits uncannily with what you would see if you were putting down an evolutionary tree. It's almost like, it's been made up. So, it's really beautiful. However, I think we have to admit, as biologists, as geologists, paleontologists, that we cannot actually directly demonstrate things that have happened in the deep past. I cannot do an experiment to show the emergence of the sorts of cell, we call them eukaryotic. I cannot do an experiment to show the sorts of cells which we may emerge by a particular process. All the evidence points to it. It will probably stand up in a court of law, but I cannot do the experiment to show that that's what happened a couple of billion years ago. We cannot directly demonstrate. We have, if you like, snapshots from the past, and we're interpreting them. But they're very much confirmed by our genetic knowledge. And this is more Rodney's scene, the age of the universe. But I need to say that, that again, we quite often hear criticism of evolution that biologists made up the age of the universe because they understood that evolution took a long time. That is not so. But actually, scientists have been questioning the age of the universe for 2 centuries before Darwin came on the scene. And I know Bishop Usher kind of clouded the whole scene somewhat with his 4004 BC on a Friday afternoon. And I love that interrogation in Inherit the Wind, the film about the trials in the States, where the attorneys say, was that Eastern Standard Time or Rocky Mountain Time? And of course it was Greenwich Mean Time, we all know that. So the universe, evolution takes a long time. And the age of the Earth and of the universe are consistent with evolutionary theory. What biological, physical, geological, chemical and physical evidence all come together, if you like, to point out that we have had time to have the process of evolution. And I will say again, the age of the universe was not derived in order to satisfy the requirements of evolution. There were geologists who were looking at mountain building and the origin of mountain ranges 2 centuries before Darwin. And in fact, one of them said that if you want to know about the age of the Earth, you go to the mountains. So here's some of the mountains they went to. These are some of the oldest rocks in the world, up there in the northwest of Scotland, the most wonderful part of the United Kingdom, and geologists investigated the rocks in this area and began to realise that they were looking at very, very, very old systems. So let's hear some more from Darwin before I shut up. Wilberforce's speech. So we're going back to the man himself. Wilberforce, Darwin understood it as a scientific criticism and went away to work on the gaps that Wilberforce had pointed out. Read the book, that is The Origin. An Oxford theologian, Dr. Pusey, had been complaining that it was a theological treatise aimed to undermine the faith of Christians. No such thing, said Darwin. And he's accusing Pusey of not actually looking at it. I should have thought this would have been evident to anyone who's read the book. I didn't write it in any relation to theology. I'm going to say that when my church minister, Exeter Network Church, preached on origins during the year of Darwin, he went and got a copy of The Origin of Species and read it. And then he ran his sermon by me before he gave it. Oh, goodness me, what's happening here? So, let's hear once more from Darwin. That should say, re God, but I don't understand what's going on here. Re God. I cannot be comforted to view this wonderful universe, and especially the nature of man, and to conclude that everything is a result of brute force. We're not saying here Darwin was a Christian. Darwin may have started off his professional life with some sort of Christian belief. The death of his favourite daughter, Anna, reduced that faith to a shred. And I think what happened with Darwin was he hung on to a sort of deistic belief You know, that there was a God who started things off, maybe kept hanging around in the background, that it wasn't brute force and chance, but nevertheless, he couldn't believe in a personal God anymore. He never ever became an atheist in the conventional sense of the word. So there's an expansion. He lost his Christian faith. So what he's saying is that it's crazy to think that you can't be both a theist, i.e. somebody who believes in a personal God, and an evolutionist. And so I'm standing here saying, yeah, he's right. Of course it's crazy to think that's impossible. And then the business about, well, you know, he's wavering about whether there's a personal God. He's never lost his idea that there is some sort of deity hanging around in the background. So Darwin himself, and I hope for those of you who have heard a lot of the negatives about the origin of species and so on, have kind of reinstated Darwin to some extent. Okay, 2009, and I deliberately kept the date because that was the big debate in the year of Darwin. We scientists believe the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, and that's still true in 2010. And looking around, talking around, and things like Murray surveys suggest that most mainstream religious believers also accept evolution. But we're going to discuss in a moment, just very briefly, what if you don't? Minority who do not. Now, I think if you are part of the minority who don't believe that evolution has occurred, then I'm going to say that I respect your views immensely, but I'm going to ask you, what do you make of the science? What do you make of the science? Are we all completely deluded? I, as a biologist, looking at the genetics. Simon Conway Morris looking at the fossils. Geologists looking at the age of the Earth. Are we all completely deluded and mistaken? And if so, how did this happen? Where does the delusion lie? Or have we made mistakes in gathering the data? Are we in some way in a kind of universal error? Or finally, and I've heard this said, are we part of a conspiracy that's actually made up the data? I actually refused to debate on a Christian radio station with somebody who said that evolution was completely made up. We made up the data as an atheist conspiracy that had to be re-aired every so few months to keep the population tame. And I think, you know, that's a very serious question, and it's a question asked with utmost respect. But if you don't hold that evolution has happened and is happening, what do you make of the science and the scientists? Thousands upon thousands of us. What do you make of this? Okay, I'm going to do one more video clip, and then just a quick summing up. Find it.
Do we come to be here by the act of a creator, or the random throw of a dice? One scientist believer says we need to ask what we mean by the word random.
The way that we think about random in the day-to-day life, which is purposelessness, is very different from the scientific way of thinking about random, which means that basically it's something unpredictable about the microscopic details of what's happening. But the overall process might still be very predictable and very beautiful. And so I think that evolution, in many ways, is the same thing. Evolution is a random optimizer, and it's probably the very best way of finding the solutions in biological space that we now call you and me.
But the question remains whether any real pattern can be detected in evolution.
The general received wisdom is that evolution is completely open-ended. It can go in any direction you like. And at first sight that seems entirely reasonable because biology, evolution, seems to be without any underlying laws. So leading from that, there is then a metaphysical assumption which says that all things are equally probable, but also everything is accidental. It could be this, it could be that. Whereas my view is actually, well, the exact reverse, that the roads of evolution are well defined, and evolution can go in only a very few directions in comparison to the immense plenitude which the neo-Darwinian would suggest.
Professor Simon Conway Morris says he can back up this claim. He's pioneered research in a field called evolutionary convergence.
Effectively, it is arguing that from different starting positions, some sort of structure emerges which is remarkably similar. In other words, I go to an aquarium, I see an octopus in the tank. I look at the octopus and she glances back at me. The eye in my head is constructed on what we call a camera principle. The eye in the octopus head is constructed effectively the same way. It's also a camera eye. Now, we know enough from molecular biology and fossil record and evolution generally that the common ancestor, indeed we do have a common ancestor with the octopus, lived about 500 million years ago in the Cambrian, could not possibly have possessed that sort of camera eye. So independently, the ancestors of the octopus, the ancestors of Simon Conway Morris, generation by generation, evolved a system which is extremely effective for seeing, called the camera eye. So that's just one example of convergence. It goes a bit further than that, because this camera eye has actually evolved independently, I think, about 7 times. So you almost get the sense that there are stable points in biological space towards which things can navigate.
But is this another scientist claiming science can prove God?
Emphatically, I would not say, here's convergence, this is a proof of anything, in fact. It merely says that the world is structured, and then you must stand back from that position and say, well, why is the world structured in the way it is? And if there are claims made by particular religious traditions, are they themselves in any way congruent with those world pictures?
Right, nearly done. Lost it again. So that particular video clip addressed the idea of randomness and chance, but some people might still find that difficult. We can maybe talk about that later. But I think overall, stepping aside now from evolution per se, I agree with this statement. It's been made by many scientist believers that true religion and good science have got nothing to fear from each other. We're part of the same spectrum of knowledge, working on different aspects of knowledge. Then we can complement each other. The second thing I would say is that positivism is out the window. Methods of science are incapable of denying the truths of religion, which is why Professor Hawking has departed so far from his normal, clear, rational self in making the statements that he's been making recently. He has not in any way disproved the possibility that God is behind all this. And I think the findings of science, I repeat this, it has been a privilege. And we have an awesome insight into the work of the Creator. When I started work on the copying of the genome, we call it the replication of DNA, copying of DNA in preparation for cells dividing, we already had a view that it was much more complicated a process than Crick and Watson had envisaged in their 1953 paper. But now, 35 years on, it is so blisteringly complex, so awesomely complex, with so many controls. As I've written in a Christian magazine to be published later this autumn, that the cell about to undertake the replication of its genome has more fail-safe mechanisms than the President of the United States has before pressing the nuclear button. The regulation is just awesomely beautiful and awesomely complex. We've added 4 steps to the regulatory mechanism since I started my PhD here. back in the 60s, and each of those involves many, many different sub-areas. Beautiful, awesome insight into the work of the creator. And if you want to find out more about this sort of approach to science from scientist believers, testoffaith.com is where to go, and we're going to have a presentation about it. Okay, let me sum up. Amongst the chattering classes in the UK, we live in a secular world. But remember, there's this kind of universal spirituality that 70% of people believe in the God of some sort. The God of St. Everywhere, or whatever it was called. And God not being an Englishman. That's what science is. The idea that we can't investigate why there's something rather than nothing. Now, I will say that Dawkins will equally face that question. Why is there something rather than nothing? He will simply say that it's just brute fact. The universe just is. And I was in a debate with the atheist philosopher Julian Beghini last autumn, and he accused myself and John Polkinghorne of invoking a god of the gaps to fit into this question about why is there something rather than nothing. Nothing could be further from the truth. We were not invoking god of the gaps, but in debate everything is feasible. We've seen how scientific empiricism has led or maybe they should be the other way around, but eventually we get to the point where we are reduced really as human beings to bags of molecules. And Rodney's written an excellent book, which is available as a second edition, called Nothing But Atoms and Molecules, which I hope is on the bookstore. Question mark. Nothing but atoms and molecules, question mark.
Indeed.
Now, I would say that the postmodernism is beginning to be in decline, I'm glad to say. We're hearing less of it. But 10 years ago, when I wrote one of my books, it was all around us. And both science and religion are threatened by the idea there are no meta-narratives, no big truths. The assumptions of positivism are questionable, but more than that. They cannot be substantiated. And we will say that science has its limits, but we cannot say there's nothing beyond those limits. And I will say very strongly as a Christian believer that religion is not without evidence. And if you stood me and John Polkinghorne and many other people in this room up here, we would say, let's look at the enigmatic person and the life and times of Jesus Christ and ask, what is all that about? And it's part of the evidence of why we are believers. There's more than that. And the conflict is therefore resolvable and shouldn't occur in the first place. So there I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That's a great start. And it's over to you, folks. Questions? Yeah.
I'm new to all this. Are there a whole load of credible scientists who, you say there's a minority who don't believe in evolution? Is there a whole raft of really credible scientists of your statures who have got equally good arguments the other way? Or is it just a minority, couple of sort of crackpots, but you know what I mean, just not credible?
I'm sure if such people were here with me, they would say that my answer is going to be socially constructed as an evolutionist. But I have met, in a lifetime of experimental science, actually doing science, I have met one practicing scientist who does not hold to evolution, and there's also another one here in Cambridge. Dr. Barnard, is it?
Oh,
the infamous Dr. Barnard, who doesn't hold to evolution. But so I know of two, and I've met thousands. So I think this is. I mean, the majority is not necessarily right, but what we're saying here is that the bulk of the evidence based on genetics, biochemistry, etc., convinces nearly every single working biologist, people actually at the coalface, that this actually is the way it happens.
Could it be fair to say that a lot of people say in the Creation Research Society and so on in the US, if you talk about biology, it would be engineers, or not that there's anything wrong with engineering, but it's not the right field to be criticised.
Yes, and I think as Darrell Fault says, most of the scientists who claim to criticise evolution are actually, they're mostly engineers, people like Stuart Burgess at Bristol here, for example. Yeah.
Yes.
You put up a slide summarising somewhere which I can't now see, but basically saying that the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, as you say. But it just, I mean, to me, that's saying science says it happened. It relates to your point about the deep past. But it doesn't say what caused it. Now, I have to confess to being an engineer, and I'm well aware of never having studied biology at all. So, you know, I'm fascinated to listen to someone like yourself. But it just seemed to me that to say that it's happened is fine, and I have no problem with that at all. It's just that the two things of it's happened and it's all built into it from the beginning get conflated, and I'm not sure they are validly the same point.
Well, they're not quite the same point. You're quite right. We have to really go right back to what life is here, and that's actually quite tough. But you know, we're going to have to define the minimum requirement for life as we know it as being a self-replicating molecule, a molecule that is capable of directing its own replication, and a little house to put it in. Otherwise, it will be open to that will be called a cell. And once you have a mechanism for copying that self-replicating molecule, it's although in today's cells it is not very error-prone, the earlier cells, I think, would have been more error-prone. So what we have here is changes in the biological structure of this self-replicating molecule, and that we call genetic diversity. So that's the first thing. That's one of the drivers, is genetic diversity. The fact that bits of DNA change different between you and me. And the second driver is this thing called natural selection. That one form of a gene may be more favoured in this environment than in this environment. So those are the two drivers. They are mechanisms, in fact. You know, I'm not like, unlike Richard Dawkins, I'm not putting evolution out as the god. So I'm trying to describe a set of mechanisms that led to this overall process. And the mechanisms rely firstly on changes in the DNA molecule, and secondly the fact that some of those changes will be more suited to particular places than others. So does that help in any way?
Well, what I hear you saying is that, as far as you're concerned, from the very earliest self-replicating molecules, it was actually built in that we would emerge in an entirely physical process.
Well, it may well have been built in that we emerge, but you know that doesn't necessarily mean that is not under the guiding hand of God the Creator.
Well, that's, if you like, where I'm coming from.
That's
what I mean about saying evolution's happened, rather than that it's happened all by itself. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, but I never said that.
no, but that's many people do.
The idea that it's under the guiding hand of God the Creator is lovely, but you've then got this dark side that I talked about. Genetic diversity also creates difficulties and problems and serious diseases and so on. And you know, dinosaurs had arthritis, for example. So the dark side of the creation of genetic diversity, if we're going to say that evolution is under the guidance of the Creator God, and genetic diversity is part of the way that He's done that, then we have to be honest and say, well, what about the dark side? How do we deal with that? How do we cope with that? It's the problem, we call it theodicy, isn't it? It's the same difficulty that Bob White would be discussing in terms of earthquakes and volcanoes. They're essential for the evolution of the Earth, but look what they do. And I think the same as we biologists struggle in the same way with genetic diversity.
Okay, I'll resist the temptation to follow that. Right.
Well, there's some drinks next door.
We'll press you a bit more before we get to drinks.
I just want to invite you to follow that up, actually, because it does seem to me, I mean, I don't have any problem with the idea of evolution being a mechanism by which God might have brought us to this point and all that sort of thing. But that really, the dark side, as you call it, really does seem to conflict quite fundamentally with the kind of, I mean, we can believe in a God who's a moral God who might use evolution, but it's quite hard to see how the Christian God we believe in could possibly have chosen a mechanism that's so cruel and dark. And you said you had a few thoughts on it, I might need to say.
Well, no, my few thoughts are that it's very difficult. You know, you hear people talking about, well, this was the result of the fall, but unless the result of the fall can work backwards, then I just don't go with that. And I struggle with that. And I think, I'm an honest theist. I struggle with that in the same way as I struggle with the idea that volcanoes and earthquakes are necessary for the evolution of the planet on which we live. Because they probably actually kill more people than genetic disorders. But and the Odyssey, isn't it?
Yes, that's the
trying to think what God's doing
justifying
here.
God's ways
Yes.
to human beings. Yes.
And so sometimes then you might want to say, well, maybe I should be a bit more like John Polkinghorne and step back a bit and say what God's done is to arrange everything so that it works, and He's allowed it to develop under its own steam.
John would say it's a package deal. The shadow side that he refers to is an inevitable, given the process whereby freedom, rationality, and so on, human, what kind of qualities we possess come about.
I think Dennis would say the same too.
Yeah, I think he would. I think Dennis Alexander would say something very similar to that, which might be some kind of answer.
Whereas I haven't reached that point yet. I'm kind of, I'm honestly struggling with it.
I think what goes on struggling.
And yet the wonder of evolution is quite astonishing. One of the things that happened to me last year was having to talk about it so often. And having recently been writing about the evolution of sex. And I mean the process of two cells coming together, not what humans might do.
Absolutely.
That what cells have to do after they've had sex is quite extraordinary. They have to reduce their chromosome number back to the original. It is an extraordinary, extraordinary process. And I look at that and think, that evolved? It is absolutely astonishing. So, there are things that mechanistically you wonder, how?
Yes.
I think this last point pushes me to a much bigger point, but if I can actually come back to a more specific one, the much, much bigger point is what do we mean by the word God?
Yeah.
And that hasn't really been addressed, but the Theodicy question
I'm not Karen Armstrong, though,
could,
so
okay, I hope we'll look at that for the whole 2 days at different points. But one of the points that pushes you towards that is, you say, I think quite rightly, we don't believe in a God of the gaps, just whatever science doesn't know, that proves God. But I still am quite suspicious of the language of a number of people on your videos earlier on, just before you started about biology. There was the talk about, how come there is something rather than nothing? The scientists don't know that. But that still is a kind of a God of the gaps, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's what Julian Maguni accused me of John Polkinghorne of doing, was saying that God fits into that gap. And we weren't. What we were trying to say was that there are big questions that lie outside the perspective of science. We weren't necessarily saying that we're going to put God into that gap to fill it. We're just saying that's a question that, there are real questions about human existence that science cannot answer. And Leibniz put it.
But then you're moving towards Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisterium.
Yeah, but
you can't have it both.
No, I think you can, because I think I think you can actually. If you think of my spectrum picture, then I think you can. So you may be way down one end of the spectrum, and the kind of empirical investigation of stuff is down the other end of the spectrum. So I think I can have it both ways in that respect, because there's no both ways. There's a continuum.
I'm going to talk a bit more about why it's something rather than nothing tomorrow, which could be controversial, but let's see where we get to when we get there. Yeah.
Is it appropriate to speak of God as having absolute power this side of existence?
Oh boy.
If
is he limited?
If he has already set the laws of creation, and therefore is subject to the laws that he has ordained for this existence.
Yeah, please, there's a theologian in the room. We need help.
He became subject when he became incarnate.
Yes, I mean, that's true. But I mean, I think that is an interesting, and again, John Polkinghorne discusses this a lot, that if God sets the laws in existence, then existence will run according to those laws.
So we cannot speak of him properly as having
Well, can we though?
power.
Because I think we would probably suggest that he can miraculously intervene in the running of those laws.
So you believe in...
miracles, yes.
Yeah, and that's quite a specific understanding of the word God.
I know.
So there's a lot of debate around it.
There is.
But in the Bible, God is revealed as a God of law right from the beginning.
Yes.
Dave's got one at the back.
Yes, let's go for Dave's question. Yeah.
Bit of a different question. You described how humanity's probably been around for 150,000 years or so,
Modern humans as we know them.
as we know them.
But the species per se has probably been around a bit longer.
Sure. Out of 4.6 billion, which is a tiny speck.
Yes.
Now, most Christian theology, and you could argue much of the Bible, puts human beings pretty much at the centre of things.
Yes, indeed.
What does that suggest about God's perspective over the rest of creation, the rest of the universe, compared to our rather human-centred perspective? And there's a follow-up which I think is a separate question, which is if we've evolved to what we are largely within the last 150,000 years, what are we likely to evolve towards?
Yeah,
I think those are two separate questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question is that there have been some absolutely extraordinarily beautiful living organisms extant in the past that are not available for us to look at now. And not just dinosaurs, but some other beautiful marine creatures, some of the tree ferns and lycopods and the insects and so on. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. And again, you ask the question, why has God done it this way? I will quite seriously ask that question. But I will say that that modern humanity, with the species' brain size, the ability to have speech, and what that does to the ability to have abstract thought and so on, has led in the last 150,000 years to the domination by human beings of the rest of the biosphere, in fact of the planet in general. And we have had a very, very grave effect on the way that the planet functions. And that is simply because the power of our brains has not been taken responsibly. But that's something that you and I are very happy to agree on. But the past, I mean, even the recent past, I find it impossible to speak for the purposes of God in this area, except to say that we are the most complicated thing that has ever appeared in evolution. And some people argue that the most complicated thing in the universe, although I suspect that we're limited by what we can find and see, is the human brain. So yeah, I mean, I'm in a sense puzzled, but also awesome process that's led to us, and aware that we are in a rather privileged position. What is humankind that you are mindful of them? You've made them a little lower than heavenly beings.
Questions?
There's one there, look.
So in terms of, you mentioned all these different years and how old the universe is, how does that fit in with your understanding of the Bible and creation, and when was all that done in terms of the 7 days?
Okay, well let's imagine that you're a nomadic tribe herding and eventually settling to have some sort of agronomic existence, but there's no science, no technology, no understanding of the function of the body except the very physical level, and you start writing down about genetic mutations. So I think firstly we need to say that the early books of Genesis were written for the people at the time, in terms in which they understood them. And so we read of the 2 lights in the sky. Well, we know that there are not 2 lights in the sky, there's only one. The moon is a mirror, for example. So firstly there's the language that's appropriate for the level of understanding. But secondly, I think we need to look at the early chapters of Genesis in relation to the other creation myths that were going on around people at the time. That the other creation myths would not have had a God who cared for the creation. There were warring gods. There were gods who were frightened of other gods. All this sort of thing. And what the Hebrew scriptures did was to say it's not like that at all. That this creation, you see, is actually the result of the activity of a being with whom the creation can relate. And it went further, actually. It said, if you like, in the sense that the creation was kind of God's house, his temple, in which he's placed an idol of himself, his image, human beings, to do the work, for other people to say, look at the way of other organisms, to look at the humans, and this is how God works. I mean, that's extraordinary, but that's what the scripture implies. So it's really a complete contrast to the other creation myths of the time. And I think it was to reinforce Hebrew understanding of their position.
So you think like the fall happened very recently in terms of the existence of the earth?
I think the fall happened, if you like, instantaneously, with the ability that the modern human species has of being able to make moral choices. That's also part of our ability, is having a sense of right and wrong. And I believe that as soon as we have that, then inevitably you're going to choose the wrong thing, and that's the fall. We don't all make the right choices all the time. And in this particular case, the picture of it is that doing the wrong thing actually means doing my thing rather than God's thing.
Yep.
You didn't quite tell us what we were evolving into.
Well, yes, okay. I think there's, in terms of our physical development, which is the most obvious, there is some evidence that there has been, at least in developed societies, there has been some evidence for, there's been quite a lot of evidence of evolution, divergence of different ethnic groups. That's sort of evolution. But it's not been anything like enough to create different species. And in fact, biologists would say that in genetic terms, there's almost no such thing as race. That, I could go and find a West Indian brother, and we could look at our DNA together, and we would find that the average difference between our genes was no more or no less than the average difference between me and another white brother. So in terms of that divergence, it looks as if we are evolving into different species, but we're not. Race is all about adaptation to particular environments. But that form of evolution has almost certainly died down because of the intermixing of humanity, because of globalization. So that's going out of the window. There has been some evolution in terms of physique and stature, almost certainly has occurred over the last 4 centuries. But partly that is an effect of a gene-environment interaction, and it's partly a result of extensive outbreeding. That we're having more genetic variety because of outbreeding, and that usually leads to increased vigour. But in terms of other things, Stephen Jones believes that man's compassion for man has actually slowed down evolution, because we no longer, if you like, give advantage to those who are genetically superior. And yet, as I will mention tomorrow, there's a kind of undercurrent of eugenics that's around in some of our genetic myths. So I think my own view is that evolution of humankind has slowed down quite considerably after a little bit of a burst.
If we were still hunter-gatherers, I don't think I'd be making it.
I can see myself lolloping across the plains.
Yes, you have a question. Yes.
Anyway,
this is God's hotline.
Yes. What sort of debates have you had with people of other faiths? I could imagine Hindus find some of this quite easy to accommodate. And what about an Islamic audience?
I had a wonderful discussion with an Islamic scientist from University College who is as comfortable with evolution as I am. But as he said, we have our fundamentalists too, he said to me. And who believe that every comma in the Holy Quran is inspired by God. So there will be fundamentalists of that nature too in Islam. The Eastern religions always think it's disrespectful to talk about this because, nature is God and God is nature. So and we're all part of the one in some Eastern religions.
But in Saudi Arabia, say, if you were asked to lecture there at the university, I mean, they're very keen on science there, most of the Middle East.
Well, they would firstly shred my Bible as I went in.
Yes, they do that.
Equivalent to burning the Quran, maybe. But yeah, my university has a link with Oman, and there's no problem about talking about evolution to the biology students.
So they really do have compartments that they...
But they may do.
Yes.
Well, no, I think as my Islamic friend said, you know, it is all about understanding how we interpret scriptures and what they were written for at the time.
Unfortunately, the director of the Faraday, Dennis Alexander, can't be here, but he's been involved in interfaith discussions on evolution in Istanbul. I think it's not without its problems in Turkey, actually. I mean, I think you're saying there are the fundamentalists in Islam and so on, but nevertheless there are Christian biologists who take it on board. I think, well, maybe we'll have one more and then we'll break the drinks. Yeah.
I was just going to ask the question, if an intelligent being is behind evolution, and we are part of that, how does that work with the resurrection? Has God got another mechanism, another concept to take us from humanity to eternity in another realm? Or have we not got there?
And it's all very mysterious, isn't it? As Paul would say, behold, I tell you a mystery. Yeah, and again, you know, if I was sort of sitting here on the back, oh, why did God do it this way? If we're bound for heaven, why do we have to go through this bit first? Except to enjoy the planet we're on. Yeah, that's part of God's plan. But we're told very clearly that our bodies won't be the same as they are on Earth. It'll be whatever a spiritual body means. But the picture is of a different form of existence, but nevertheless an existence in which individuals know and recognise each other. And that's all I think we can say. Because nobody's come back apart from Jesus from the dead. We have no idea. We can't have any idea what it's like. So we just have to have the kind of poetry and pictures that were given to those that wrote the scriptures.
Well, thank you very much, John. That's got us off to a really great start. Thank you.
And I need a beer. Now, who knows where the picture was? That was the wallpaper on the computer screen, on the screen.
Was it the Isle of Harris or something?
Well, you're not far away. It was actually Greenock Bay in West of Ross, just south of Alaport, north of Yellow. On a fine May day.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.